Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 20th video for the New Testament Survey course. In this section, we'll introduce the Pauline epistles by first looking at the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul. All of this information can be found in the book of Acts and Paul's epistles, but for convenience, we'll summarize it here. First, let's look at Paul's life. Paul was providentially prepared and equipped for the ministry that he would eventually be given. His background made him uniquely qualified for what he would undertake to accomplish. He was, in his own words, a Hebrew of Hebrews. That means he was a full-blooded, faithfully practicing Jew who was fluent in the Hebrew language. He was born to Jewish parents in Tarsus, which is in Asia Minor, between Antioch and Galatia. And he also described himself as a Pharisee according to the law. He was trained and observant in the strictest sect of Judaism at the time. And he moved to Jerusalem at an early age, and he trained in the Jewish law under Gamaliel, probably the most famous and well-respected rabbi of that time. And he probably became a rabbi, at least a rabbi in training, because he had authority, and he was entrusted by the Sanhedrin to take up the persecution of Christians. And Paul was a Hellenistic Jew. That means he was comfortable in more than one culture. He was a cosmopolitan, educated, bicultural man. He was Hellenistic. That means he was culturally Greek. So he had missionary fluency. He spoke the Greek language fluently. He was able to quote Greek authors when speaking to Greeks, and he handled Greek customs without any problems. Yet he was Jewish in his thinking and faith. So even when dealing with Gentiles, he did not assume or buy into their pagan worldview. And Paul was also a Roman citizen, and that gave him privileges and rights, which served him well on his missionary journeys. It protected him legally in some situations, and it actually opened the door for him to eventually preach the gospel in Rome. So in many ways, God had prepared Paul for the ministry that he would call him for. And Paul was a persecutor of the Christian church. Paul first shows up in the Bible story when he persecutes the believers in Acts. He approved and assisted when Stephen was murdered for preaching Christ. And he went on to be, in his own words, a persecutor of the church. He traveled around arresting Christians for merely being Christian. He said his attitude and reason for doing this was that he was zealous for God. Try and put yourself in his mindset. He was convinced that the Christians were wrong and were blaspheming God and hurting people by spreading what Paul thought was untruth about God. Paul reasoned that Jesus could not be the Messiah because he was crucified. After all, the law clearly stated that cursed is anyone hung on a tree. Therefore, Jesus was cursed and could not be the Messiah, according to Paul's thinking at that time. And therefore, the movement that celebrated Jesus must be stopped by any means, Paul thought. But Paul was then miraculously converted. He had an encounter with the risen Christ that changed him forever. And his conversion forced him to rethink everything. The cross did not mean that Jesus was cursed for his own action, but he was taking mankind's curse upon himself as a substitutionary sacrifice, just like was prefigured in the Old Testament sacrificial system. Therefore, Paul concluded, Jesus was the Messiah, acting as the suffering servant before becoming the reigning king. And therefore, the church was not rebellious blasphemers, but was the new, faithful people of God. And Paul also rethought what it meant to be Jewish, to observe kosher rules and customs. Now he concluded, it is still okay for Jews to be kosher. Paul never discouraged Jews from keeping their customs, but he was very clear that it was no longer necessary for Jewish Christians. and it certainly was not necessary for Gentiles in order to be in right relationship with God. Paul realized that kosher rules and customs were never okay as a means to try to earn justification. They were never intended to do so, and they would always be counterproductive for justification. Paul had come to the same conclusions as the Jerusalem Council in Acts, but Paul had learned this long before the Jerusalem Council, as a result of his conversion. And at the time of his conversion, Paul was also called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. He was told he would proclaim the name of Jesus before Gentiles, before the people of Israel, and even before pagan kings, which he later did. And at his calling, he was told that he must suffer greatly for the sake of the gospel, which he later did. And Paul describes his calling as a tremendous grace given to him by Christ, which it was. And Paul credited all his ministry success to the continuing grace of Christ given to him for the sake of his ministry. So, almost immediately after his conversion, Paul began proclaiming Christ and proving him from the Scriptures. Now, the rest of the story of Paul's life and ministry has already been covered to a certain extent in the book of Acts, and we'll continue to see more details of Paul's life in his epistles. But for now, let's look a bit more carefully at Paul's ministry methods. We saw in the book of Acts that Paul made evangelistic journeys to places that had not yet heard of Christ. And he started in the urban centers because they were the hubs of influence. And he then trusted the churches he had established to then reach out to the surrounding areas. In other words, he didn't try to reach every place himself, but tried to get it started in an area and then trusted God to grow it throughout that area without needing Paul's direct involvement. Now, as an aside, I need to make a disclaimer so that we don't make too much of Paul's strategy of starting with the cities. Because Jesus actually did the opposite strategy. Jesus started in the backwater, nowhere, despised places. And he was mostly rejected in the urban places of influence. My point is that it might happen that God will convert Hollywood and Washington, D.C. and Wall Street and thereby influence the world. And we should work to reach these places and institutions. But it's just as likely that God will raise up revival in some small town in Nebraska that will then influence the world. Neither option is bad. Neither option is guaranteed. And my advice is if you live in Hollywood, work to reach Hollywood. If you live in Nebraska, work to reach Nebraska. And trust God with the result. Now, back to Paul. Everywhere he went, Paul proclaimed Christ. He proclaimed Jesus as Messiah, the fulfillment of all the Old Testament hopes. And he proclaimed Jesus as Savior, who rescued his people from their sins and their alienation from God, which brings wrath. And he proclaims Jesus as Lord, the risen master and ruler of everything, who reigns over all and who will return to finalize his victory and kingdom by judging the world. Paul's strategy when he entered a new place was to start in the Jewish synagogue, if there was a synagogue in that place. Because the synagogue was a place with people already familiar with the Old Testament story and expectations, and who were longing for the Messiah. So it was the logical place to start, with the easiest connection point. And Paul, in the synagogue, started with the Old Testament scriptures and used them to proclaim Christ. But Paul also proclaimed and taught in the marketplace and in the educational meeting places of that day, wherever people shared news and discussed current issues of the day. And in these situations, Paul started the discussion with nature and common grace, that is, those experiences common to all humanity, but he used this as a means to get connection, but then get to the truth about Christ as directly as possible. informed by the Bible. And in every venue, Paul experienced a mixture of acceptance and rejection. Some people accepted the message, and some people rejected the message. Therefore, some welcomed Paul, and some rejected and persecuted Paul. Paul's message had a way of inevitably dividing people, either for or against, just like Jesus himself caused this mixed response. And it was impossible to stay neutral to the gospel back then, and the same is true today. Therefore, Paul often stirred up trouble wherever he went. Technically, it was not Paul who made the trouble, but the people reacting to Paul. And Paul continued to teach and disciple the people who believed the message about Jesus. He trained them in the full story and significance of Jesus, and he trained them how to think and live in light of this. In some cases, Paul was able to spend long periods of time in a certain place doing this. In other cases, Paul was only able to stay in a place for a short period of time. But even if Paul could not be in a particular place, he still continued to oversee the new churches from a distance. He raised up local elders as soon as was reasonable to lead the new churches. Then he regularly sent delegates, such as Timothy and Titus, to help the churches, especially if there were problems or issues that needed to be addressed. And then Paul sent letters to instruct and encourage the churches, which is how we got 13 of the books of the New Testament. And Paul also made personal follow-up visits to the various churches as often as he could. And finally, Paul regularly prayed for all the churches, because they were God's churches, not Paul's. And only God can grow and sustain his people. Now, one last item of Paul's ministry methods that I want to mention is that Paul took up a collection from the churches to help the poor in Jerusalem. Paul organized charity to help the struggling Christians in an area with economic hardship. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that Paul took great pains to show no possibility of fraud or any impropriety in the way that the money was handled. Now, let me give you a brief listing of the theological issues that Paul talks about, just some of the general categories. We'll talk about these in more detail after looking at Paul's epistles, but I wanted to list them to give you some things to watch for as you read and study these epistles. First is the gospel itself. What is the good news according to Paul? And what difference should this make for his readers and for us? Next is the cross. How does Paul explain the cross and its impact? And the resurrection. According to Paul, why is the resurrection of Jesus such a big deal? And what difference does this make for us? And also notice how Paul proclaimed Christ as Lord. What does he mean by this phrase? And why does this matter? And watch for how Paul talks about salvation. What does it mean to be saved? Why does it happen? And how does it happen? If you ask Paul, how can I be saved? What would he say? And then watch out for how Paul thinks about the law. Now, be advised, Paul uses the term law in a few different ways throughout his epistles. So use the context to discern exactly what Paul means each time he uses the term the law, because he means different things at different times that he uses the same term. But try to understand Paul's attitude towards the Old Testament law and what place it has in the Christian's life. And next is the issue of the church. According to Paul, what is the church and how should it function? What is the purpose of the church? Who is part of the church and how do they become so? And then watch for what Paul teaches about the relationship of Jews and Gentiles. Can a person be both a Christian and a Jew? If so, how? And how can a person be a Christian if they are a Gentile? And how can these two types of people be Christians together? And then, how should Christians live according to Paul? What does a Christian lifestyle and Christian ethics look like? And what should be important for a faithful Christian? And finally, watch for what Paul taught about the end of the age and the coming of the kingdom. What did Paul teach about the already present aspects of God's kingdom? And what did Paul teach about the aspects of the kingdom that are still yet to come? How will this age come to completion and the kingdom be fully realized? These are just a few of the major things to look for as you read Paul's epistles. Now, finally, in this section, let's just list Paul's epistles themselves. In the New Testament, Paul's epistles are arranged roughly by length, the longest book to the shortest book. That means they're not arranged chronologically by time of writing. Now, his epistles can be put in a few groups chronologically, and they're often studied this way. The first group is his early epistles, written during his missionary travels. These are Galatians, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Romans. And the next group is called his prison epistles, because they were written when he was in prison. And they are Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. And the last group is called the pastoral epistles, because they were written to individuals who were pastoring churches, and they deal with some pastoral issues. These were likely the last of these epistles that Paul wrote, and they are 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. These are all the epistles of Paul that we have in the New Testament. So now, let's review. Paul's life could be summarized: prepared, persecutor, converted, and then proclaimer of Christ. And Paul's methods were proclaiming Christ, starting churches, discipling and teaching believers, raising up leaders, and overseeing churches. Now, this has just been an introduction to Paul and his ministry. And then in the next few sections, we'll look at each of Paul's epistles on their own, starting with the book of Romans. And I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.